Hey guys, we're going to do a video on John 6. This is one of the main passages Catholics use to try to teach that you have to literally eat the flesh and literally drink the blood of Christ in order to have eternal life in you. And what we want you to see is in the context here, when Jesus is speaking to them, using the analogy of the manna to indicate that he is typified by that he himself is the living bread, or he's the bread from heaven, the true bread, and so what this trying to indicate is that the person of Christ is what God was communicating through the manna from heaven, and Jesus is trying to show them that they ate that manna and died, but this is I am the true bread that you can eat thereof and not die, and so the hungering and thirsting here would be after righteousness in that sense. And so he uses these types of analogies before in the book of John and after, and they're not taken literally, like we said in the previous videos. If you take where Jesus said, John 3 to Nicodemus, that you must be born again, Nicodemus didn't understand and said, how can you be born and enter the second time in your mother's womb? And when he told the woman at the well that he had water to give that she could drink thereof and not thirst, well, she said, well, give me this water that I don't have to come back and draw out of the well, and she didn't understand. And here in this passage, we would say that Jesus is using that type of language, and they didn't understand him. They said, how can we eat his flesh? And how's he from heaven, And then in John 10, he said, I'm the door, and I am the good shepherd, and they didn't understand what he was saying. So this confusion that's generated in the mind of the natural mind from the words of Christ was somewhat intentional, because he was trying to get them to receive a revelation of who he was, because that's really eternal life, is to know Jesus Christ. He says in John 17:3 to know Jesus Christ, and the way we know him is through his revelation of himself, through his works and through his words, and so when you see Jesus saying, I am the bread from heaven, he's not talking about his flesh per se, because he didn't have flesh when he came down from heaven. And so when he says to eat the flesh of the Son of Man and to drink his blood to have eternal life in you, he's talking in the context about believing and seeking him, believing on him and seeking on him. He uses this repeatedly, and we see it in John 6 verse 40. Jesus said that this is the will of him that sent me, that everyone that seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life. Verse 47, he that believeth on me hath everlasting life. And then he says in verse 54, whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life. So it's synonymous with believing on him. To eat his flesh and to drink his blood is to learn of him. Jesus said to learn of him, that his flesh is meat indeed, his blood is drink indeed, meaning we live off of that revelation of his death, the blood of his cross, that the atonement basically is how we receive spiritual life, is that revelation, that we receive life from the scriptures. Jesus said back in John chapter 5, search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me. And then he said, you will not come to me that you might have life, in verse 40. And this matches John 6, when Jesus said, every man therefore that hath heard, in verse 45, hath heard and hath learned of the Father cometh unto me. And so learning of Christ by searching the scriptures is what he's referring to. His revelation, his words. Jesus even said in John, the same chapter, verse 63, it is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. So the words that are speaking to you, they are spirit and they are life. Paul said, that it is the spirit that gives life, the flesh profits nothing, or the letter killeth rather, in 2 Corinthians 3. So Jesus, when he's speaking of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, it's believing on him, seeking him, and he says in John 6:29, this is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he hath sent. In verse 35, he says that he is the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger. He that believeth on me shall never thirst. He says in verse 40 that we just read that, 40 and 47. So the same way that Jesus lived by the Father, he says in verse 57, he that eateth me, even he shall live by me. And Jesus says, I have meat to eat that you know not of, to the disciples. His meat was to do the will of him that sent him. And so it's in that sense that we live by Christ, is that we learn of him, and that we believe on him, and that we seek him, and that we live that life that he gives. And so he gave his life on the cross. That was the doctrine of the atonement. He gave himself for the world. He offered himself without spot to God. He gave his physical life on the cross to propitiate the justice of God. And then he gives life. He gives eternal life, not his physical life, but eternal life to whosoever believes in him. So the doctrine is the meat, the doctrine concerning his death and the offering of his body. That's what it gives you eternal life, is to have faith in the truth about Christ. So Paul was determined, he said in 1 Corinthians 2, not to know anything among us save Jesus Christ and him crucified. All right, so I'll put some verses in the description below, and let me know what you think.